This video is going to talk about the battle of the two franchises that are two of the most legendary, most iconic video game franchises when it comes to adventures, whether you want to call it JRPG or action adventure, open world, medieval, with knights and dragons and swords and shields and towns you can go into and buy items, whatever you want to call it. This video is focusing on The Legend of Zelda versus Final Fantasy from a franchise standpoint. Again, the original Legend of Zelda was an attempt to have directly controlled arcade combat in a large adventure world. Before The Legend of Zelda, you had large adventures on large maps with indirect controls like in the Condor 64 Dungeons and Dragons games or those arcade games on a single screen. Super Mario Bros. Was revolutionary in 1983 because it featured seamless scrolling. The Legend of Zelda was the first to give players arcade control of the combat and searching for secrets in real time. It's an arcade game on a adventure map. Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Amin Parker. If you like this content so far, subscribe to my channel or click the like button. Now I'm going to continue. The description of the Legend of Zelda game emphasizes free gameplay and self-directed adventure. Forget everything you know about the Legend of Zelda games. Step into the world of discovery, exploration, and adventure in The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild, a boundary-breaking new game in the acclaimed series. Travel across vast fields, through forests, and to mountain peaks as you discover what has become of the kingdom of Hyrule in this stunning open world adventure. Now on the Nintendo Switch, your journey is free and more open than ever. Take your system anywhere and adventure as Link in any way you like. This was the tagline to The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild when it first hit the Nintendo Switch. The tag further down the page is simply a metadata tag so that it'll show up in more searches in the hope that a consumer who is into large JRPG adventures will also want to crack out an action adventure game. Now, I pound the table on this issue as this characteristic of The Legend of Zelda, and then Zelda 2, The Adventure of Link, and the so-called Zelda 3, A Link to the Past, as well as Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom, is what caused them all to sell like they do, which is sell like crazy. The linear point and focus on stuff other than the player playing in Final Fantasy is part of what is causing Final Fantasy to flop. Or should I say, heavily decline in sales. Back in the late 90s and the early 2000s, spectacle sold over gameplay. It was a big deal to see classic franchises from the original Nintendo Entertainment System and the Super Nintendo Entertainment System be reimagined on the PlayStation 1 and the Nintendo 64, as well as the PlayStation 2, the Dreamcast, the Nintendo GameCube, and the Xbox with quality 3D rendering. Many of the third parties learned the wrong lesson in that they came to believe that they could churn out the same game but with better production values over and over again to higher and higher sales. Ultimately, what is causing Final Fantasy to decline heavily is it is not making new fans because its gameplay has not evolved enough to hook in new players. The gameplay is stagnant and downright becoming boring. The Legend of Zelda was at a very similar crossroads after Skyward Sword. Follow me. Twilight Princess sold very, very well in the Western countries of the world, but not so well in the Eastern countries such as Japan, because it had excellent production values, but the gameplay was pretty much the same as it was in times past with Ocarina of Time and the Wind Waker. So basically, it included taking all of the spectacle and gameplay from those previous 3D reimaginings of the series and pushing them to new heights. Nonetheless, Japanese consumers were not as excited about that. Then Nintendo tried to put more story elements and make the gameplay more linear, but that caused the series to decline in the West. Sort of the mirror image of Final Fantasy stagnating in the West and now declining heavily in Japan. What did Nintendo decide to do when they found themselves in a similar situation with The Legend of Zelda? Well, they went after the gameplay and focused on making a good game for all human beings of all ages, no matter if you're 10 years old or if you're 60 years old. It wasn't a Japan versus the West type of mentality. They specifically said that they looked at The Legend of Zelda for inspiration. Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom are the opposite of Final Fantasy in that its teams refocused on upgrading the gameplay when the series stagnated, while Final Fantasy team focused on changing the visual presentation. We are witnessing a real-time experiment in what happens when you upgrade the gameplay versus upgrading only the visual presentation. Nintendo focuses on gameplay, and Square Enix is focusing on the graphics. Imagine if Final Fantasy came back to the Nintendo consoles from where it started from originally. Nintendo will make sure that Square Enix focuses on gameplay. Whereas currently, because Square Enix is tied at the hip with Sony now, and we all know Sony care about graphics over gameplay. This is why Final Fantasy is suffering. Because they're focusing on graphics and they're not focusing on gameplay at all. These two series started out on the same console back in the 80s. Final Fantasy and The Legend of Zelda have a long historical rivalry in the hearts and minds of gamers. Even though they're from two different genres, these two game franchises are very unique and similar. In this competition, in this battle, which franchise is going to win in the end? To be continued.